Aloha and welcome to Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroots Institute. I remember back in the primary for the pre-President Clinton, there was a phrase that was put up all over the campaign room and began to be spread all over the country, and that was, "It's the economy, stupid." In other words, when it boils down to everything in a political campaign or in life, it's the economy, stupid, or maybe not stupid, but it's the economy. I wonder how true that is here in the state of Hawaii. We certainly feel the economy, and yet in the midst of the beautiful sunsets and sunrises and the calm breezes and the ocean, we may sometimes forget how much the economy hurts. Today I've got somebody who's been an observer of the economy for many, many years from an expert vantage point. He's an economist, but more than that, he's also served in very prominent settings, such as the Council on Revenues, and he's a former chief economist of the Bank of Hawaii. So if anybody should know what's going on here, an economist, well, I hope an economist would. And so will you join us today as we have as our guest Paul Brewbaker. Paul, thanks for joining us today.
Keli'i.
It's always great talking with you.
Yeah, nice to be here.
It was great having you on a panel recently in which we talked about the state of the state's finances.
Right, right.
Well, let's go to basics for our viewership. Our viewers are from all over the world and Hawaii, and we are interested in understanding Hawaii and its relationship to the world and impact in both ways. But let's first talk about you, an economist. So tell us, what is an economist?
Somebody that studies the economy. I mean, it's pretty simple.
Well, you know, I was at the graduation of my son from the University of Southern California, and they divide up on the campus into different schools.
Sure, yeah.
So there was a school in which economists were being graduated.
Right, right.
And the provost announces that the degrees have been conferred on these economists and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome 245 new economists to the world." And then there was a groan in the audience.
Yeah, when I graduated, the econ majors and the biology majors were about equal in number. That was the big rivalry 40 years ago.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, what exactly do economists do? For example, you've worked on the Council of Revenues, you've worked for Bank of Hawaii. What is your trade?
Well, it's changing. I'm a private economist,
yes,
a consulting
today.
economist, so I do a lot of non-financial corporate work, even though my background is in financial analytics. Working with developers, doing some litigation support, helping people think about the economic outlook and so on. Basically, the field's divided broadly into the macro or overlook of the whole economy, and then the micro part of it, which is sort of looking at the behavior of different elements, firms and households, for example.
Well, let's talk a little bit about our Hawaii economy. You know, for the uninitiated, perhaps into formal economics,
right.
It can be pretty scary. We see the prices, we see the cost of living, we see the housing now, where a median income family would have to pay $700,000 for an average home on Oahu and so forth. Or that's the median price.
Yeah, everybody would have to pay $700,000 for the median home.
You're right.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but we can be baffled as laymen and look to politicians and economists for solutions. What's going on in our economy? What do you see?
Let me kind of do the 30-second university version, and then we can pick off individual topics, because you listed enough for several hours of conversation. But the main thing for people to remember when they're thinking about Hawaii is that it's a small, open economy.
Okay.
So by small, I mean it literally is of small size, small economic size, small population base. But in addition, it's geographically remote. By open, I mean that we have an open trading system in which Hawaii participates, so goods, services, information, especially now with internet, are all sort of in the tradable space. And what you typically observe in such situations is small regional economies tend to specialize in a small number of activities, which their specialization allows them to export to the rest of the world, and then they import the things that it's less efficient for them to try to produce.
And
on their
that's
own.
us, a small regional economy.
And that's us, a small
Okay.
regional economy. In fact, most people actually live in small regional economies. Ours is only different because you can't drive to the next county. But so you'll have, Detroit has sort of
Sure.
specialized in certain things, and Southern California in others. Northern California has its own set of special tricks. In Hawaii, we've predominantly focused on tourism in the last half century.
Yes.
And the federal military part of the economy is still a significant share, disproportionately significant, so larger than you'd find in other economies.
Now, you mentioned the fact that we just can't drive to the next state, we
Right.
can't drive to the next economy,
Right.
and so forth. What kind of impact does that have upon us? I think we all realize we pay higher prices in terms of energy and for shipped-in goods and so forth. But how does that work? Why is it that we have such higher prices due to the shipping and due to the distance we have?
It turns out the shipping doesn't actually contribute as
Really?
much to the differential that you'd observe in living costs as the housing costs per se. But to the point, because individual mobility is constrained by the Pacific Ocean, we rely on transportation businesses as service providers to connect us in terms of merchandise trade opportunity, in terms of aviation access. And that pattern has settled into the current model now for several decades. I mean, there was a time in the transition to containerization where the ocean surface transport, surface carrier industry evolved, and there was a time moving to commercial passenger jet aviation, and then deregulation of that industry, where things evolved. But they've kind of settled into a pattern the last decade or two.
Now there's a pattern. I'm a little curious. You mentioned that the shipping costs are not as significant a factor.
Right.
And I can understand, yes, that the scarcity of land for housing is probably a driving factor here. But let's talk about
Not
shipping.
as much as you might think,
okay.
but yeah.
Well, let's talk about both of those
Yeah,
factors.
sure.
Both the housing and also the shipping. Let's go to shipping first.
Well,
Doesn't it
yeah.
cost far more for transport of goods through any of our lines, such as Matson and Horizon, between the Hawaii and other destinations?
So the way to get a handle on that
Yeah.
is to go walk into Walmart across
All
the
right.
street here and compare the prices you'd observe there, or at Costco or Home Depot or Target or one of the large format, low margin, big box retailers. Compare the cost of items there with the costs that you'd find in the same retail outlets up on the mainland. And as it turns out, my recollection is the margins are something like 5% or something like that. But even better than that, if you want to get really nerdalicious about it, you can go look at the state's input-output model, and they provide examples of how much loading there is at these different
Sure.
stages of transport costs, sea, carriage, and surface transport. I mean, trucking, distribution, and it's much smaller than I think most people think. But like I say, you could just go look at the average item in a Walmart, and you'll find that on average the margins are relatively small. I think what most people identify with is specific items like milk, or now the one I love, cereal, breakfast cereal. And there you have a situation where you could fill a container with Lamborghinis, or you can fill it with cereal boxes, half of which is air. So what's happening is you're moving a relatively low yield item, cornflakes, the packaging of which means half that container is just air. And either way, you're going to pay the same rate for the container movement. And moving the container by container ship to Hawaii over the ocean is not that much more expensive than moving it across the country, for example.
Now, you mentioned the big box stores like Costco.
Right.
And I might even, by inference, talk about automobile dealerships and so forth. And there is a general price parity, isn't there, in Hawaii?
It's price parity, I don't
Well,
misunderstand.
all right.
It is cheaper in Oklahoma City. There's
Sure.
no question about that, although real estate's a big
Okay.
part of that. But yeah, the margins are actually relatively small
Okay.
on the average sort of
Now,
consumer good.
Is
Yeah.
is that because store chains such as Costco and Sam's Club are taking the loss across the nation in terms of the
No.
cost of shipping and making it up?
No, it's actually a testament to the amazing efficiency of our distribution system, of the logistics that you know, determine the flows of these items. So if you wanted to make a material contribution to reducing the living cost differential, the transportation part is probably not the first place you would look. I'm not saying there aren't ways to harvest you know, reduction in that premium, but it's relatively small. And the thing is, we have all the data to. In fact, there's a new data set, if you go data set from the Bureau of Labor Statistics you can go to, in which they now calculate what they're calling regional price parity indices, RPP. Go, you know, Google BLS RPP, Bureau of Labor Statistics, regional price parities. And for rural and metropolitan areas, which is a useful distinction because of the real estate, you'll find that the consumer goods and services part of the spectrum shows relatively small differentials, but that the housing component is the biggest one. If you wanted to materially influence or reduce the living cost differential, you'd focus on housing.
Well,
Now,
I do want to talk about housing.
yeah, let's come back to that, because there's
Let's
still
go back
interesting
to-
things to talk
yeah.
about in transportation.
And in terms of transportation, you know that we've had guests here on this program, individuals you know, who make a strong case that the cabotage laws, the Jones Act
Right.
of 1920s and so forth, create a protectionist situation here, which ultimately leads to a scarcity of ships being built in the United States for cargo transport between U.S. ports that results in higher prices in Hawaii.
Yeah.
What is your understanding of that? And
Well-
we definitely want to delve into the different understandings of the
Yeah.
Jones Act and its impact.
Yeah, so you'll find that my view on this is different from
Okay.
the sort of conventional wisdom. And the conventional...
And I just might pause here
Yeah.
for a moment just to say to our viewers that we've had quite a bit of discussion on this topic. We've had as a guest Michael Hansen of the Hawaii Shippers Council. We've had Ken Skulland of Hawaii Pacific University. And I would refer you on our website at the Grassroots Institute and also at ThinkTech Hawaii to take a look and reference the arguments put there. Today I want to give a fair hearing to Paul Brewbaker because he represents a viewpoint that, whether you agree with it or not, it's a viewpoint that is held by a large number, if not the majority, of those in industry and government here in Hawaii.
Actually, I don't think anybody holds my views. But,
Okay, well, we'll get the Paul Brewbaker
we can come
point.
back to that if you want. In fact, I have never seen anybody posit what I'm about to.
This
The
is
only-
breaking news.
Well, not really. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of anybody that's actually gone out and studied this in any formal sort of, you know, certainly not in any econometric way, not recently. And there may be some of that, I may be wrong about that. I have worked on the issue on behalf of one of the shippers. Actually, I've worked on a related issue for another shipper in private consultancies. So I'm free to say what my findings were, but not to say who the consultants were. But I will say
I
this.
can make a guess between 1 and 2.
Well, you'd be surprised.
All right, 3. Go ahead.
I think your reference to Michael Hansen is a really important one. So Mike runs the
Hawaii
head of the,
Shippers Council.
Well, isn't it Pacific Maritime something or Pacific?
Well, he may be affiliated with another organization, but I know his work relating to the Jones Act
Yeah.
is done as part of the Hawaii
Yeah.
Shippers Council.
So here's where I think Mike and I agree, which is an important starting point. The blanket condemnation of the Jones Act is, I think, per se, is flawed, and I'll come to specifics about why that's true. But there's an important element of that I think is really important, and that Mike has talked a lot about, that I think is really important, and that's the domestic build requirement. So one of the provisions of the Jones Act is that these vessels in use within the United States be basically U.S. hulls. And there are more efficient builders of ships in the world, elsewhere in the world. And so denying yourself the opportunity to buy a foreign-built vessel means that the cost of that vessel is going to be more expensive. It turns out, amortized over the life of the vessel and so on and so forth, the contribution to that cost loading, per unit of shipped whatever, in the unit cost per shipped item is of second order smallness. So I'm not sure there would be a measurable gain. For example, if you're talking about the two fleets that are out there right now for Trans-Pacific service to the U.S. West Coast, I believe there are 16 vessels. So if you were to rotate one or two of those out, and these are vessels that have usable lives of 20, 30 years, it would take you a half century to sort of get to where any of the gain from using, say, Korean-built vessels would be realized in any meaningful sense. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but
that's fascinating. In fact, when we come back after a break, I want to ask you about the amortization and the way those ships are financed. But
you betcha.
But
yeah.
I appreciate the point of view you're bringing, and say to our viewers that we really want to explore what's going on in the way the economy works and the way the economy is viewed by economists here. And I'm very pleased to have Paul Brewbaker with us, a very senior and experienced economist in Hawaii. I'm Keli'i Akina. You're watching the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network, and we'll be right back after this short break.
Aloha, my name is Josh Green. I host a show called Healthcare in Hawaii here on ThinkTech. We get together once a week or sometimes twice a month. Depends. When we're busy, we get together less often, but we love to see you here to talk about the preeminent healthcare issues in our state. Our programs vary very widely. We talk about economics, we talk about healthcare, we talk about social issues on this program. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Today I'm talking with economist Paul Brewbaker. And we quickly went from a broad view of understanding why prices are the way they are in Hawaii in general terms, and focused on a couple of issues. We've started to talk about the first, the second being housing, which we'll get to, but first of all, transportation of goods to the islands. We ultimately ended up talking a bit about the Jones Act, and Paul was pointing out that really, when you think about it, there's remarkable, similarity between prices here for a good number of items, if not most, and on the mainland. So shipping may not be as significant a cost. Is that right? Would you explain that again?
I think basically that's right. There are places where you could save a little bit, and probably the build requirements where domestic shippers don't have access to foreign-built vessels is one that is really worth thinking about changing. My guess is if you change some of the other requirements, not that much is going to change, but we should talk about that as well.
Now you said that even if we save money by being able to buy our ships from our allies overseas rather than from the United States, that wouldn't mean a lot, because over the amortization of the life of the vessel, we really are dealing with 25, 30 years per vessel. It's not going to make that much difference. But isn't it the case that for Jones Act compliant ships, that most of that is actually funded by the federal government through up to 87.5% in terms of low interest loans? So we really have the government subsidizing the cost differential, and ultimately that impacts us as taxpayers.
If you heard that from somebody like Mike that knows those figures, I would take his word for it. I don't know that. The curious part of that is if the rest of the country is paying for my boat, and I'm chipping in my fair share, the 1.5 million people in Hawaii versus the 300 million people in the U.S., I'm going to let the other 298.5 million pay their share. I'm sure that's not the case.
Maybe from a Hawaii ship owner's point of view.
Well, I think the more important issue that we should be talking about is the structure of the industry and the nature of the geography, so the spatial economic equilibrium that we're talking about. And here's how to think about that. Go to Google Earth, rotate the planet around so that you have Shanghai at one antipode, so to speak, on your screen of the Pacific Basin, and San Francisco or Long Beach at the other. so that an equator is formed by eastern China and southern California. And then if you have that rotated around, so that's the equator, you know that's the shortest distance. It's the Great Circle Route. Where would Hawaii be in that configuration? Way down here. So the anomaly which we observe, that massive container ships go all the way across the Pacific, and then tiny ones, the ones that serve Hawaii on what's essentially a backhaul, is actually dictated by the fact that Hawaii is not on the way to anywhere. And we know that because the Jones Act does not prevent foreign carriers from serving Hawaii directly.
Right.
There's no prohibition, and in fact, we have service from NHK and a few foreign shippers. So
it only prohibits ships from doing cargo
between the U.S. West Coast.
Between the two U.S. ports.
That's right, but not from Vancouver.
Sure.
And not from Central America or Mexico. So, so you have to be careful about over-promising in the event the Jones Act were to go away. I'm not saying it shouldn't. I'm just saying it's one of those be careful what you wish for scenarios, because typically what happens in a change that dramatic, and I'll give you an example in the airlines, is that you go through a period of turbulence before the new equilibrium obtains, and at the end of the day, you might have foreign shippers, but of course nothing prevents foreign shippers from serving Hawaii already. So you might not even have that. So I think the sort of casual assertion that the cost of living would be lower and that everything would be better and more efficient without the presence of the Jones Act is a little naive, but certainly there are elements that are worth looking at, and this other issue, changing industrial structure, is important to keep in mind.
And some of the points that you raise, of course, I know you've researched them, and these are carefully thought out, are debatable points with others. For example, some argue that if foreign ships could travel from Hawaii after depositing cargo to another port, that there could be an incentive for more foreign ships to come to Hawaii.
Except that if
yes.
you look at the geography, Hawaii's not between anywhere important and anywhere else that's important.
What if there was trade in terms of the Pacific Rim and the emerging nations?
That's what I'm talking about.
Yes.
I'm talking about trade between East Asia and North America. It all goes north of Hawaii.
Okay.
So the way the distribution of productive capacity is currently organized in primarily East Asia, in our region, in East Asia, and primarily North America, we are not on those shipping lines. If we were, foreign shippers would already stop here. We're out. So it's like, remember the math, right? The sum of the squaws on the hides is equal to the squaw on the hippopotamus, right? We're on the two short legs that add up to a longer leg than the short leg. But the example I wanted to refer to is Fred Kahn's deregulation of the civil aeronautics board in 1978. You remember Fred Kahn,
Right.
the famous industrial organization professor at Cornell, was appointed the head of the airline regulator, the CAB. And Fred was an advocate of deregulation, airline deregulation. He said, if you put me in charge, I'll get rid of the agency. And we moved to a period of turbulence, shall we say, where the industry restructured. And ironically, today we have about the same number of carriers, roughly 8 major carriers serving Hawaii, as we had prior to CAB deregulation, except that we have fares set in the marketplace and much more capacity at much lower cost than we used to. So the hope in deregulating ocean surface transport is that a similar kind of transition or transformation could occur over time. The question is whether in the moment after, my guess is if you remove the Jones Act, one surface carrier will disappear, and only one will remain for a time until another one emerges. And it may be foreign, but it may be domestic, but who knows? In the same sense that once Aloha Airlines disappeared from inter-island service, we ended up with one dominant carrier, what's called a Stackelberg equilibrium, one dominant carrier and then a bunch of small guys, and nobody flies unless they really have to. It's a leader-follower arrangement as opposed to the duopoly or oligopoly with two key players that we had prior to 2008.
Let me ask you just one more question about the Jones Act. You say your position is not necessarily the one reflected by other people.
Right.
What I hear very frequently, especially in the political arena, is the importance of maintaining the Jones Act for national security. And
Yeah.
what is your assessment of that claim?
So that's economists poo-poo that idea, and it's been the national defense argument's been overused through the years. On the other hand, any veteran of World War II, and there are fewer and fewer today, will tell you that there was a moment to be thankful for the protections that the U.S. Merchant Marine had at that time. I suppose bad things happen. I'm happy that the U.S. Navy has a significant presence at Pearl Harbor, and maybe that suffices to provide the national defense protections that are sometimes used as an argument. I think that's probably the weakest of all the arguments. But if all of shipping to Hawaii were owned by state-owned enterprises in the People's Republic of China, you might have a different view of things.
Well, what I'd love to do sometime is perhaps a panel in which we could have multiple viewpoints discussed, and we could see that interaction on some of the points that you've made, and you certainly would provide great insight. Let's move to another factor.
Yeah.
Everybody knows our cost of housing is exorbitant compared to the rest of the country, what are the factors that contribute to that? If it's not solely or so much shipping, as you say, what is it?
Again, I think it's really useful and important to refer people to the data. And there's a brand new data set that helps with this. So if you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or just Google regional price parity indices, they've done some of these calculations, and they're expanding their calculations to build out over time. So right now they have calculations, I think, from 2009 to 2013 or something like that. What those clearly show, both for the metropolitan areas, an island like Oahu, and rural markets, and this is really important because it's very useful to compare rural markets, for example, in the western United States, to the key metropolitan areas that sort of dominate our thinking but have very different conditions from the rural areas. Consistently, what's shown is goods and services, price differentials, living cost differentials, aren't that dramatic. But in housing, Hawaii, California just leap out.
Okay, so that's what the data says.
We'll
come back and analyze that data right after this brief break. I'm with Paul Brewbaker, noted economist here in Hawaii, and you're watching ThinkTech Hawaii's E Hana Kako weekly program. We'll be right back after this short break.
Aloha, my name is David Day, and I'm really interested in international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security, and that's why I host ThinkTech Global. I bring in guests from all over the world who know about these various issues in enormous depth and detail. Come learn with me every Thursday afternoon right here at 4 o'clock. I'll see you there.
Welcome back to E Hana Kako. We're on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network, and I'd like to say mahalo to Jay Fidel and all of the staff of ThinkTech Hawaii. You can see other programming at www.thinktechhawaii.com. Now back to our fascinating conversation with economist Paul Brewbaker as he gives his insights into really what causes prices to be so high here in Hawaii. We're talking about housing, and during the break you were making reference to a UHERO, University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, study that you consider to be definitive.
I think so. Many of us who follow the housing economics literature have wondered about this. I believe UHERO got some money to actually do a study on it, and they published a paper in 2010 on what's called inclusionary zoning, or IZ policies. Inclusionary zoning policies are those in which a jurisdiction mandates that a certain proportion of new housing formation be dedicated to certain proportions of the population, so that the quotas, so to speak, are defined by the distribution of income. And what they show, and what the literature has shown, is that those policies are universally a failure, that they produce they result in less affordable housing and less housing overall.
And what you're talking about is the way in which government creates these deals with developers
Yes.
that mandate certain percentages of what they develop to be affordable housing.
Precisely.
Good intention,
Absolutely.
but in reality you're saying that they really mess up the price structure for housing.
Politically well-intentioned
Mhm.
because they're appealing in a superficial way to people who don't understand the housing economics, and people
Right.
vote. But the worst thing you could do if you were actually going to deliver more affordable housing. Now, an important question to deal with before we talk more about the policy question is why housing is more expensive and why it would be anyway, even if we had better policy. And the answer is, hello, it's Hawaii. I mean, if housing were cheaper here than in lots of other places, those people would all move here, which would bid up the price of housing, which is why the housing's not that cheap. So even in a world such as the one we have, with perfect capital mobility and in which individuals can move, and even in the dream world where there was economic opportunity in which they could find jobs and opportunities for self-employment, in that world, the environmental, the natural endowment, the natural environment of the state, plus the cultural environment, really a unique and very congenial cultural environment, would invite, as it has through history, people to migrate to Hawaii if the housing were cheaper, which in turn would bid up the housing. So the differential in which housing is more expensive in Hawaii, and for that matter, the fact that housing is more expensive in the San Francisco Bay Area than it is in the Central Valley, it's more expensive in San Diego than it is in Phoenix, it's more expensive in Manhattan than it is in central Pennsylvania, all reflects the same kind of thing. The price differentials serve as an equilibration mechanism that stabilizes the migration that otherwise would occur from the more expensive places to the cheaper places.
Well, let's take that on a smaller level. I remember at a time when buying a home in Hilo or buying a home in Lihue on Kauai was considered a bargain deal. Mm-hmm. And then as these areas became more exposed to people buying from across the country, the world, and
Sure.
so forth, the cost the price is bid up because it's a valuable commodity.
So you're correct, halfway. That
Yeah.
you've talked about the demand side of the market, where there's a supply side. We
Now
can
that's
talk
what I
about.
want to get into. Is the
But
supply.
you would still find, if you look at home prices in East Hawaii Island, that they are significantly lower on average than they are on Oahu. And you would find that on Kauai, they're not as low as they are on the Hilo side of the Big Island, but they're not as high in general as they are on Oahu. Although in the last housing cycle, prices on Kauai, sort of median prices or measures of central tendency of the home price distribution, those prices on Kauai and Maui did in fact exceed those on Oahu briefly. And you'd also be correct if your guess is that the offshore investor participation on the demand side of the housing market was an important factor to which one can attribute that temporary but nonetheless dramatic upswing in prices. It didn't last very long. They came down.
To what extent is
yeah.
the scarcity of residentially zoned land part of the driving up of prices?
Yeah,
Is that something that keeps prices high?
There's no question that restricting the amount of developable land is going to contribute to its scarcity and therefore to the costliness one faces in building a new home. Let's say you have to buy the land or
Right.
or lease it. However, there are geographic reasons for that, and in fact, a great recent paper by an economist named Andrew Paciorek, P-A-C-I-O-R-E-K, if you look it up, shows that, as he describes it, steep slopes and water bodies are uniquely associated with the pattern in which prices in those markets exhibit cycles of greater amplitude, exhibit more volatility. And the reason is that when there is a demand event, when there is an increase in demand, say from low interest rates or an increase in investor enthusiasm from whatever, animal spirits or whatever, that increase in demand outstrips supply more readily in markets that face these geographic constraints. In Hawaii, we build on a narrow coastal margin between the ocean and Mauka upland watershed that we need to preserve, or we need to preserve as a natural environment in order to maintain our water resources. And so, so we sort of naturally face boundaries that are also true in coastal California and in certain markets on the East Coast as well. They tend to be more common. So they're more prevalent in Boulder, Colorado, up against the mountains, than they are out, east of Metro Denver itself, where you can radially expand across the prairie if you want. But to those geographic constraints, some of which are aspirational, we aspire to preserve open space to keep our agricultural and conservation options open on this island. So there, some of it is the geography itself, but some of it is we aspire to a certain, kind of urban configuration and an urban interface with the rural or natural landscape. But some of it is regulatory, and the part that we can manage is the regulatory part. The part we can manage is how far do we allow the boundaries to move at any moment in time.
Now, what's the percentage of land in Hawaii that is available for residential construction or is occupied by homes now?
Yeah, it's kind of ridiculously
It's fairly
small.
low, isn't
it?
I
mean,
About
there's
2 to
4
3%.
million acres of land in Hawaii. 2 million are in the ag, designated ag district of the state's land use law, and 2 million are conservation lands. And then there's about something like 200,000 all
Sure.
in.
And now this may be beyond your scope as an economist, but how much more of the landmass of Hawaii do you think could be developed without harming the aquifer, without harming the watershed reserve?
So there's a different answer to that on each island.
Okay.
And I try not to speak whenever possible for
Every
neighbor island jurisdictions.
How about taking one?
But I'll pick Oahu since that's where I'm from, and I get a vote. And my sense of it on Oahu is that we're kind of at that moment where it makes sense not to expand the urban boundary outward and to focus. It's a kind of a 21st century moment, and to focus on making urban density more efficient.
And so this is what is going on. This is in the Kaka'ako area. We're looking at the dynamic of building upward.
Sure.
In 21st century ways that bring diversity.
20th century ways, but that's fine.
All right,
yeah.
20th century ways.
Yeah. Welcome to the 20th century.
But that's the problem we're trying to solve here.
You have to think of it in terms of the space-time continuum. So we're thinking about space, how far should we migrate across the island? But really the question is time, in that once you get out to about an hour-long commute from centers of employment, it's not worth it. You see what I mean? It's not worth spending 2 hours of your day, not really, to get to, 47th and 6th Avenue, maybe so, but to get to King and Bishop Street, yeah, hell no, not more than an hour.
Sure.
And that hour is the most valuable hour of your day. It's the hour you would have been coaching soccer with your kids. It's the hour you would have spent in pleasant conversation with your wife over a leisurely breakfast if you weren't sitting in the traffic. So Honolulu's gotten to that point, and with all due respect to the second city concepts and so on, the fact is that there's an agglomeration economy that occurs in the urban core. This is true in every city. That is the reason why everybody wants to get down there. There's a kind of a productivity enhancing interaction that's an unintended, uncompensated benefit of our co-location.
Now, when you talk about this productivity taking place in an enhanced way, you're also talking about economic activity.
Absolutely.
And so
I'm literally talking about more productive production of services, goods, and information.
So then when we talk about the growth of the urban core, when we talk about greater density and so forth, we're also looking at something that could be the pathway to eventually relatively lowered prices for goods in Hawaii. Are you saying that?
I'm pretty sure,
or a more robust economy.
I'm pretty sure we won't make a material contribution to reducing the broad across a broad swath of consumables to reducing those costs. However, if we're all more productive, we'll all earn higher incomes. So that's the reason you do it, is to increase per capita output and therefore per capita incomes. You will have a contribution to reducing living cost difference to the extent you have a more efficient organization of production and distribution. So don't misunderstand me on that. But my guess is the biggest contribution would come in making housing more accessible and more affordable.
Okay.
And by removing the barriers to its development in these dense urban formats.
Well, Paul, this has been very informative to understand the way that you are looking at the system. And forgive me if what I'm about to say may be an oversimplification. In fact, correct me if I am. I remember earlier you said, well, this is Hawaii. Hello, this is Hawaii. Are you saying that basically our prices are something that we basically are going to need to live with? This is just part of being in Hawaii, and that we're really not going to be able to affect major initiatives that will drive prices down. Our best hope is to have more economic activity so many of us could have more money.
I think that's
Yes,
generally true. I think the important focus should be on not wishing for as much gain in the living cost differential compression as hoping for more efficiency on the in terms of productivity and compensation.
Well, I appreciate what you've shared with us. It's really definitely food for thought for me. And do you realize we've come to the close of our hour?
It's amazing how fast it goes, right?
It is. And I've enjoyed having you on board. Thank you, Paul.
My pleasure, Keli'i.
And we'll keep up this conversation. Yeah, I hope you've learned something today. The economy is an extremely complex issue, and what we're trying to do here at ThinkTech Hawaii, as well as Grassroots Institute, is understand some of that complexity. You may have heard things that you agree with resoundingly, and you may have heard things today that you disagree with. But this is part of a much larger ongoing conversation, and that's the important thing that we need to do as citizens, as policymakers, as those who elect public officials, and those who provide, like Paul does, expert input. And when we put it all together, then we can have a better understanding of what it takes to build a better Hawaii together. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroots Institute on ThinkTech Hawaii's Ehana Kako. Paul Brewbaker has been my guest. Thanks again, Paul.
Mahalo.
Mahalo. We'll see you next week. Aloha.